Also coming up when we get to the narrative structure part, there's a single large block of time, which we call how does it work? This is when the technical expert is sort of laying out exactly the benefits, the features, the challenges they had making something, how, all the detail around how the solution might fit into the prospective client's business and problems it solves and so on, how it does it, what it runs on, all that kind of stuff. Even that section needs to have its own two pivots. The first pivot is getting into that section, and you start detailing how the solution works. And about halfway through it, or 2/3 of the way through it, you need to think of the whole thing as a part one and part two. And the idea here is that by the time you get to 50 to 65% done for the overall picture of how it works and blah, 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 then you do a pivot into a second, how does it work? The second, how does it work section, which is part of the overall, how does it work section, is where you do either a deep dive pivot or a horizontal pivot. A deep dive pivot is where you've spent some time talking about your solution or whatever complicated thing the company sells. And then you pick one thing that most people ask about, one thing that might be particularly useful to that audience, one thing that's probably something they've never experienced before, and you drill down into it. And then you just do, you pretend like it's a how does it work section, but just for that one thing. And that will take you from, let's say, 65% of the time in that you've spent on how does it work all the way to the end of the how does it work section. And so that's a deep dive pivot where you dive right down into one thing or one like very constrained kind of subject, and you just like explain the bejesus out of it. The other kind of pivot at the 50 to 65% mark is a horizontal pivot. And that's where you take everything that you've explained to them as if it is applicable to them, and then you go off and talk about a subject, a topic, an application that they probably have never thought about. Now, this is a little trickier, but it can be very, very fruitful. Here's why. So here's an example. Let's say that you have a software solution, SaaS, impact legal services, engineering heavy, whatever. And it does X, right? It's for people who make ABC widget. And then at around the 2/3 mark, you do a horizontal pivot. And instead of talking about how this is used by manufacturers, you basically tell them a story about how it's used by hot air balloonists, or how it's used by Navy SEALs, or how it's used by stay-at-home moms. I don't know, right? Something way off. The whole point is they'll stay with you because it's a novel application of what you made and something they've never thought about because they're obviously focused on their own industry, on their own business. Most people really like seeing a story, hearing a story, seeing examples of something that they only ever thought about in one way being used far afield in something else. So it has to be an application that, on the one hand, virtually nobody is using that's in the audience for your webinar, but at the same time is something that they can easily understand. Like, you would not do a horizontal pivot into a very niche kind of field where none of them have ever, molecular biology, if all they ever do is work on machinery. Okay. But, other kinds of machinery or little gadgets or children's toys or something that they would get, right? That's sort of adjacent and understandable without requiring specialized knowledge. So that's a horizontal pivot. So going back at about the halfway to the 2/3 mark, you do a pivot inside the how does it work section. You either go way deep and talk about one thing to provide sort of the richness of detail that you couldn't do at a high level, or you do a horizontal pivot where you pick something adjacent to but understandable to that audience, and you talk about how it applies to that thing or how it's used or how they tried to use it and it didn't work and here's why. So it's basically you're recounting a story, a tale about a different way to think about and use whatever complicated thing is that your company makes.